poor widow rescued the prince from drowning. Next day, he made her his queen. The river roars like thunder. A poor widow clings to a rope, dragging a drowning stranger from the dark waters. But when she pulls him to shore, she finds not just a man. She finds the future ruler of the land. By sunrise, he kneels before her in front of the village, swearing she saved his life. The crowd gasps, for his vow sounds like a proposal. Yet in the gilded halls of power, whispers turn to fury. The nobles will never allow a fisherwoman to sit on the throne, and when a sealed treaty reveals he is already promised to another, scandal threatens to destroy them both. Behind the silk curtains of the court, enemies sharpen their daggers, and secrets from her past rise like ghosts. She saved his life once, but can love save them from a kingdom ready to tear them apart? Comment below and tell me where in the world you're joining from. And if this story made you pause for a moment, hit that subscribe button for more. The storm raged across the Danube as day faded into dusk, its angry waters rising higher with each passing hour. Wind howled through the small fishing village, rattling shutters and bending trees until they groaned. In her humble cottage near the riverbank, Marta Havel worked desperately against time and nature, her strong hands gripping the rough hemp of her fishing nets. "Lord above, grant me strength," she whispered, her widow's shawl whipping about her shoulders as she dragged another net toward higher ground. These nets were her livelihood. Without them, she would have no way to feed herself. Through the winter months ahead, the river's roar grew louder, its muddy waters churning with debris torn from upstream. Branches and broken boards rushed past, carried on the current's mighty shoulders. Marta's arms ached as she hauled the last net, the coarse rope cutting into her palms. Then she heard it, voices crying out over the storm's fury. Squinting through the gloom and rain, Marta saw something large tumbling in the current. No, not something. Someone. A man clung to a piece of driftwood, his head barely above the rushing water. Her heart pounded against her ribs. The sensible thing would be to run for help, but there was no time. The stranger would be swept away before she could reach the village. Marta's hands trembled as she grabbed a length of rope from her pile of nets. "Mother Mary, protect us both," she prayed, quickly tying one end around her waist. The other end she secured to the sturdy post of her cottage's porch. Drawing a deep breath, Marta waded into the flood. The water's icy grip shocked her, stealing her breath. The current pulled at her skirts, trying to drag her under. One step at a time, she pressed forward, leaning against the rope's support. The stranger's dark head bobbed closer, then vanished beneath the surface. "No!" Marta lunged forward, plunging her arms into the murky water. Her fingers brushed silk, then found purchase on wet fabric. Using all her strength, she hauled upward, pulling the man's face above water. He was unconscious, his fine clothes suggesting wealth far above her station. Getting them both to shore nearly broke her. The rope cut into her waist as she fought the current, dragging his dead weight through the flood. Her muscles screamed in protest. Just when she thought she could hold on no longer, her feet found firmer ground. Inch by inch, she hauled him onto the riverbank. The stranger lay still as death, his rich garments soaked and torn. Without hesitation, Marta hooked her arms beneath his shoulders and dragged him toward her cottage. Inside, she laid him as close to the hearth as she dared, where flames still flickered from her cooking fire. "Please, Lord, let him live," she murmured, her cold fingers checking for signs of life. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Hope stirred in her heart. Moving quickly, Marta gathered every blanket she owned, wrapping him in layers of worn wool. She added wood to the fire until it blazed high, warming the small room. In her storage chest, she found dried herbs for fever and healing. These she brewed into a simple broth, the kind her mother had taught her to make. Through the long hours, Marta tended to her mysterious guest. She wrung water from his dark hair, chafed his cold hands between her own, and spooned small sips of broth between his pale lips. As she worked, she prayed for his life, for guidance, for wisdom in helping this man who was clearly far above her humble station. The storm gradually quieted outside, though rain still drummed steadily on her roof. In the hearth's warm glow, Marta studied the stranger's face. Even unconscious, he carried himself with dignity. His features were noble, his hands unmarked by labor. Who was he? How had he come to be in the river? What would happen when he awoke? As if in answer to her thoughts, the man stirred. Marta leaned closer, watching as his eyelids fluttered. Slowly they opened, revealing eyes as blue as summer skies. His gaze focused on her face with growing awareness. When he spoke, his voice was weak but carried the refined accent of nobility. "I am in your debt, good woman. I am Prince Alaric, heir to this principality." Golden morning light pierced through the storm-washed sky, making the droplets on Marta's window sparkle like tiny jewels. She had risen before dawn, as was her habit, though her muscles ached from yesterday's rescue. The worn wooden floor creaked beneath her feet as she moved quietly, trying not to disturb her noble guest who slept near the dying embers of her hearth. Her fingers worked swiftly at mending the fishing net spread across her lap, weathered hands moving with practiced ease despite her exhaustion. The familiar task helped calm her racing thoughts about the extraordinary turn her simple life had taken. A soft groan drew her attention. Prince Alaric stirred, his fine features confused, as he took in the humble surroundings. The rough-hewn walls, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and the simple furnishings of a fisherwoman's home. "Good morrow, your grace," Marta said softly, keeping her eyes lowered as she set aside her work. "How do you fare?" He touched his head gingerly, then looked at her with wonder. "You pulled me from the river. I remember your face above me, like an angel in the storm." Marta felt her cheeks warm. "Your grace is too kind. I did only what any soul would do." "Not any soul would brave those waters," he insisted, struggling to sit up. "You risked your life. For a stranger, please call me Alaric." "Oh, I couldn't, your grace. 'Twouldn't be proper." She hurried to pour him a cup of herb tea, her hands trembling slightly as she offered it. "I insist," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You saved my life. Surely that earns you the right to speak my name." Before Marta could respond, excited, voices rose outside her cottage. Word of the prince's presence had spread through the village like wildfire. She opened her door to find a crowd gathering, their faces filled with amazement and curiosity. Prince Alaric appeared behind her, still, pale but standing tall. The villagers immediately dropped into awkward bows and curtsies, many never having seen their prince so close before. "Good people," Alaric announced, his voice carrying clearly despite his weakness. "This brave woman saved my life last night. When the storm threw me from my horse near the ferry crossing, it was Widow Havel who pulled me from certain death in the Danube's waters." Murmurs of awe rippled through the crowd. Marta felt their stares and ducked her head, uncomfortable with such attention. The prince departed soon after, assisted by 2 village men who helped him return to the palace. Marta tried to return to her normal routine, but her thoughts kept straying to his kind eyes and gentle voice. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the village square, the sound of hooves and wheels drew everyone outside once more. A magnificent procession approached. Gleaming carriages, mounted guards in ceremonial uniforms, and at their head, Prince Alaric himself, now dressed in full court regalia. The villagers gathered again, this time in even greater numbers. Marta stood frozen in her doorway as the prince dismounted before her cottage. To her utter shock, he approached and then knelt on one knee before her, taking her work-roughened hand in his. "Widow Marta Havel," he declared in a voice meant to carry to all present. "You showed courage and nobility of spirit that many of noble birth would do well to emulate. You are my savior, and I am forever in your debt." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Marta saw the astonishment on their faces, the way some of the women covered their mouths with their hands. In their eyes, she read their thoughts clearly. Such a gesture from a prince could only mean one thing. Her heart pounding like a wild bird in her chest, Marta gently withdrew her hand and backed into her cottage. She closed the door with trembling fingers, leaning against it as her legs threatened to give way. Through her window, she could hear the excited chatter of the villagers, already spinning tales of romance between prince and commoner. Sinking into her chair by the hearth, Marta pressed her hands to her burning cheeks. She knew she should feel only fear at such dangerous attention, at the scandal surely brewing. Yet beneath her sensible concerns, a warm glow had kindled in her heart, one that whispered of possibilities she had never dared to dream. The lone candle flame danced on Marta's worn wooden table as she knelt in prayer, her calloused hands clasped tight. Evening shadows stretched across her humble cottage, but sleep remained far from her thoughts. Again and again, she saw Prince Alaric kneeling before her, his noble gesture setting the village abuzz with whispers. "Dear Lord," she whispered, "grant me wisdom. I am but a simple widow, yet my heart trembles with feelings I dare not name." The morning brought a fresh surprise. As Marta pulled her day-old bread from its cloth wrapping, a knock echoed through her cottage. There stood Prince Alaric himself, without guards or ceremony, dressed more simply than yesterday, though still fine enough to mark his station. "Good morrow, Marta," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "I hope I do not intrude too early?" "Your Grace," she curtsied, flushing. "I have nothing fit for a prince's breakfast." "Please," he smiled, stepping inside. "What you have is exactly what I desire." No palace feast could match the honest simplicity of bread shared in true company. Marta's hands trembled as she served him at her rough-hewn table. To her amazement, he broke the coarse bread with evident pleasure, praising its hearty flavor. "In my palace," he said softly, "I am surrounded by silk and silver, yet starved for authenticity. Every word spoken drips with honey-coated ambition." His eyes met hers. "But you, Marta, you spoke truth even when addressing a prince. You saw, not my title, but a drowning man in need." "'Twas only right, your grace," she murmured. "Alaric," he corrected gently. "I find myself bound to you, Marta Havel, not merely by gratitude for my life, but by something deeper, something I have never found in all the gilded halls of nobility. At the palace, word of the prince's frequent visits to the fishing village spread like wildfire through marble corridors and tapestried halls. In her chambers, Duchess Isolde paced with calculated fury, her silk skirts rustling like angry whispers. "A common fishing widow!" she hissed to her gathered confidants. "This cannot stand. The very thought of such low birth ascending to the throne, it turns my stomach." Her painted lips curved in a cruel smile. "We must ensure this presumptuous creature knows her proper place." The Duchess set her schemes in motion, spreading poisoned rumors through the court. Some whispered that Marta practiced witchcraft to ensnare the prince. Others claimed she had engineered his near drowning to play the heroine. Yet Alaric seemed blind to these courtly machinations. As evening fell that same day, he summoned both nobles and villagers to the great hall. Hundreds of candles blazed in crystal chandeliers, casting light on the assembled crowd. Silk-clad aristocrats on one side, homespun wool and leather on the other. Marta stood uncertain between these worlds as Alaric strode to the center of the hall. His voice rang clear and strong. "My people, high-born and common alike, I stand before you to make known my heart's choice. In Marta Havel, I have found not only my savior, but a woman of rare courage and truth. I hereby declare my intention to make her my queen." Gasps echoed through the hall. The villagers' faces shone with joy and pride, while the nobles grew pale with shock. Duchess Isolda's fingers clenched her fan so tight the ivory cracked. But before anyone could speak, the great doors burst open. A herald in Vienna's colors strode forth, his boots echoing on marble as he unrolled a scroll. "Your Grace," he proclaimed, "I bear news from the imperial court. The treaty is sealed and signed. You are promised in marriage to Princess Elena of Austria, to unite our lands in lasting peace." The silence that followed pressed like lead upon Marta's chest. She stood frozen as noble faces turned toward her with triumphant sneers. "Duchess." Isolda's lips curved in a victorious smile. The villagers whispered in dismay. Marta felt the weight of every stare, every judgment, every cruel smile. The future she had barely dared to dream of crumbled like sand through her fingers. Yet she held herself straight, refusing to bow her head even as her heart shattered within her breast. The next morning, a gilded carriage arrived at Marta's cottage, its polished wood and brass fittings gleaming in the early light. A liveried footman stepped down, bowing slightly as he presented a sealed letter bearing the prince's crest. Inside, written in elegant script, was a summons to the palace, not as a bride-to-be, but as a student of court etiquette. Marta's hands trembled as she packed her few belongings into a simple cloth bag. The villagers gathered to watch her departure, their faces a mix of pride and concern. As the carriage pulled away from the riverside cottage that had been her home since marriage, Marta pressed her rough palm against the window, watching the familiar fishing nets and humble dwellings fade into the distance. The journey stretched for several hours, through landscapes she had never seen. Fields gave way to grander estates, then to the outskirts of the capital city itself. Marta's eyes widened at the sight of towers and spires rising against the sky, their stones catching the midday sun. The streets grew busier, filled with merchants, carts and fine carriages, until at last they passed through the palace gates. "This way, if you please," a stern-faced woman in dark silk directed, leading Marta through marble halls that made her feel small and out of place. "I am Madame Dupont, your primary instructor in matters of etiquette." The afternoon passed in a whirlwind of introductions. Seamstresses clucked their tongues and took measurements, holding up fabrics finer than anything Marta had touched before. A dance master demonstrated the proper way to curtsy, while another tutor corrected her speech whenever she slipped into village dialect. Throughout the palace, Marta noticed the divide in how she was received. The servants offered warm smiles and whispered encouragement when their superiors weren't looking. "You'll do fine, miss," one maid murmured while helping her dress. "We're all hoping you succeed." But the nobles were another matter entirely. As Marta practiced her new steps in the gallery, ladies in elaborate gowns passed by, their fans fluttering as they exchanged smirks and whispers. "Imagine a fishwife in silk," one sneered, just loud enough to be heard. Prince Alaric found her in the late afternoon, as she struggled to master the proper way to hold a teacup. His presence caused all the tutors to bow and retreat, leaving them a moment of privacy in the small teaching salon. "You're bearing up well," he said kindly, noting her flushed cheeks and determined expression. "'Tis harder than pulling in nets." "Your Grace," Marta admitted, then caught herself. "I mean, it is most challenging, my lord." His smile held warmth, but also worry. "Marta, you must know, this treaty with Vienna, it binds more than just me. It could mean peace or war for thousands." "I understand, my lord," she said softly, though her heart ached at the reminder. As evening approached, a page led Marta to the prince's private dining chamber. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting a gentle light over the intimate setting. It was grander than her cottage, but simpler than the main palace rooms, with tapestries warming the stone walls. Their supper was modest by royal standards: roasted fowl, fresh bread, and wine. As they ate, Alaric encouraged Marta to practice her courtly phrases. She stumbled over the formal language, and soon they were both laughing at her attempts to pronounce French terms for the dining implements. "Pray tell," she said with exaggerated formality, making him smile, "is it proper to use this tiny fork for the bird, or shall I be hanged for improper cutlery?" Their shared laughter felt like a bridge across the divide of their stations, if only for a moment. Later that night, in the fine chamber she'd been assigned, Marta knelt beside her bed. The silk nightgown felt strange against her skin, the mattress too soft after years of sleeping on straw. Through her window, she could see the river in the distance, its waters reflecting the moon's light. "Lord," she whispered, her hands clasped. "In prayer, let me be of use to him, even if not his bride." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she brushed it away, determined to face whatever tomorrow might bring with the same strength that had served her through all life's storms. 2 weeks had passed since Marta's arrival at court, and spring painted the city with fresh colors. The morning of the palace-sponsored fair dawned bright and clear, with cherry blossoms dotting the cobblestone streets like scattered snow. Marta stood before her chamber mirror, smoothing the folds of her new gown, Ai's modest creation in dove-gray silk that somehow managed to look both elegant and humble. The palace servants had dressed her hair simply, with just a single pearl pin holding back her dark curls. "You look perfect, miss," whispered Anna, her lady's maid, adjusting the fall of fabric. "Just as you should. Yourself, but finer." When Prince Alaric arrived to escort her, his eyes softened at the sight of her. "My lady," he said, offering his arm, "shall we greet our people?" The word "our" made Marta's heart flutter, though she knew it could not truly be so. Still, she placed her hand in the crook of his elbow, drawing strength from his steady presence. The fair sprawled across the palace grounds and into the city square, filled with merchants' stalls, musicians, and the mingled scents of spiced wine and fresh bread. Common folk and nobles alike strolled between colorful banners that snapped in the spring breeze. As their retinue moved through the crowd, Marta noticed how the people parted, not with the usual stiff bows they gave to nobles, but with warm smiles and eager waves. A small girl with flowers in her hair broke away from her mother and ran forward, holding up a slightly crushed daisy. Without hesitation, Marta knelt down, her silk skirts pooling around her. "What a lovely gift," she said warmly, accepting the flower. "May I?" The child nodded, and Marta tucked the daisy behind the girl's ear. "God's blessings on you, little one," she said, making the sign of the cross. The mother's eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Near the baker's stall, Marta spotted 3 boys in patched clothes, staring longingly at the fresh pastries. She remembered her own childhood hunger all too well. Without a word to her escorts, she approached the baker and drew out her own purse, not the palace allowance, but the coins she had saved from her fishing days. "3 of your finest apple tarts, if you please," she said clearly, aware of watching eyes. The baker bowed deeply and wrapped the treats in clean linen, which Marta herself handed to the astonished boys. "Share them fairly," she told them with a wink, "and save some for your mothers." The crowd's reaction was immediate and heartfelt. "God bless our Marta!" someone called out, and others took up the cry. Even some of the nobles in attendance looked thoughtful, watching how easily she bridged the gap between classes. As evening approached and the chapel bells rang for vespers, hundreds gathered in the square. Alaric guided Marta to the steps, where tradition demanded she address the people. Her heart pounding, Marta raised her hands for silence. When she spoke, it was not with practiced eloquence, but with the simple truth of her heart. "Good people," she began, her voice carrying clearly in the hushed square. "I stand before you not because of any merit of my own, but by God's grace alone. He guided my hands that stormy night. He gave me strength to help our beloved prince, and he has blessed me with your kindness these past weeks." She paused, turning to include both commons and nobility in her gaze. "I thank His Grace Prince Alaric for showing that true nobility lies in how we treat one another, not in titles or birth." The response was thunderous. "Our true queen!" someone shouted from the crowd, and the cry was taken up by hundreds of voices. "Our true queen! Our true queen!" Marta saw several nobles shift uncomfortably, but many of the palace servants were cheering too, their usual reserve forgotten in the moment's passion. As darkness fell, torches were lit along the streets. Alaric himself took one to light their way back to the palace, dismissing the guards to walk with Marta alone. "Did you hear them?" he whispered, his voice full of restrained hope. "The people's love for you is pure and strong. Perhaps—" He glanced around before continuing even more softly. "Perhaps their voices will prove our strongest weapon against the treaty's demands." Marta said nothing, but her hand tightened on his arm as they walked through the torch-lit streets, their shadows dancing together on the ancient stones. 2 nights after the spring fair, as evening shadows lengthened across the palace grounds, a messenger knocked at Marta's chamber door. His livery bore the crest of Duchess Isolde, and his message was clear. Her presence was requested immediately in the Duchess's private parlor. Marta's heart fluttered as she followed the servant through gilded corridors. She had heard whispers of the Duchess's influence, how she had expected to win Prince Alaric's hand before the foreign treaty was arranged. The massive doors to the parlor opened, revealing a room that sparkled with golden ornaments and crystal chandeliers. "My dear Marta." Duchess Isolde rose from her silk-upholstered chair, her voice honey-sweet, but her eyes sharp as glass. "Please, do come in. We have much to discuss." The Duchess gestured to a delicate chair across from her own. She wore a gown of deep burgundy silk that caught the firelight, making her seem aflame. "Some spiced wine?" she offered, lifting a silver pitcher. "The cinnamon is from the East Indies, a particular favorite of mine." "You are most kind, Your Grace," Marta answered carefully, accepting the goblet with slightly trembling hands. The rich aroma of the wine filled her nostrils, but she only pretended to sip. "I imagine you're wondering why I've summoned you at this hour," Isolde said, her fingers trailing along a wooden box on the table beside her. "You see, I've recently come across the most fascinating document." She withdrew a sealed parchment, its edges yellowed with age. "It concerns your late husband." Marta's breath caught in her throat. The Duchess's painted lips curved in a cruel smile as she unfolded the document. "According to these records," Isolde continued, "your husband was suspected of consorting with river smugglers before his tragic death at sea. The evidence is quite—" She paused, savoring the word, damning. The room seemed to spin around Marta. Her husband had been an honest fisherman. She knew this in her heart. But he had died in a storm 5 years ago, taking any proof of his innocence to the bottom of the Danube. "This is a lie," Marta whispered, her voice stronger than she felt. "Perhaps," the Duchess replied, carefully refolding the document. "But lies can destroy reputations just as surely as truths. Imagine the scandal, the prince's chosen companion, widow of a criminal." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a silken whisper. "Leave court quietly, return to your village, and this document need never see the light of day." Marta's hands clenched in her lap, knuckles white against her skirts. She thought of her husband's weathered face, his calloused hands, his quiet dignity. She thought of Prince Alaric's trust, the people's love, the chance to do real good from a position of influence. "No," she said, rising to her feet. Though her voice trembled, her spine was straight. "I will not be driven away by false accusations against a good man's memory." The Duchess's face hardened to marble. "You are making a grave mistake, my dear. Remember, you are nothing but a fisherman's widow. This is your last chance to leave, with your dignity intact. My dignity comes not from titles or threats, Your Grace, but from truth and honor." Marta moved toward the door, her steps measured despite her racing heart. "Good evening." Back in her chamber, Marta's composure finally cracked. Tears slid down her cheeks as she lit a fresh candle and pulled out paper and ink. There was one person who might remember the truth, the old fisherman who had worked alongside her husband for 20 years. Her quill scratched against the parchment as she poured out her desperate plea. "Dear friend, I write to you in my hour of need." The candle burned lower and lower as she wrote, explaining everything, begging him to search his memory for any detail that might clear her husband's name. As she sealed the letter with a drop of wax, dawn's first light began to creep through her window. The candle had burned through the night, but Marta's eyes were clear and determined. She would not let lies destroy all she held dear, not her husband's memory, and not her chance at a life of purpose. The first rays of dawn painted the sky in soft pink and gold as Marta's messenger mounted his horse, her carefully written letter tucked safely in his saddlebag. She watched from her chamber window as he crossed the palace courtyard and disappeared through the great gates, heading north along the winding river road. Her heart traveled with that letter, carrying her hopes for vindication. Days crawled by, like years. Marta spent her mornings in etiquette lessons, afternoons walking the palace gardens to calm her nerves, and evenings praying for word from the old fisherman who might clear her husband's name. The journey upriver was long, at least 4 days by horse in good weather, longer if spring rains had muddied the roads. On the 5th day after her letter's departure, a commotion stirred the palace. Through her window, Marta watched as a procession of foreign carriages rolled through the gates, their black lacquered sides gleaming. Footmen in scarlet livery jumped down to open doors, revealing stern-faced men in rich foreign dress. "The envoys from Vienna have arrived," whispered one of the kindly chambermaids who had taken Marta under their wing. "They're here about the marriage treaty." That afternoon, raised voices echoed from the council chamber. Marta could not make out the words, but the tone made her shiver. When Alaric emerged hours later, his face was drawn with worry. He found her in the library, where she had been practicing her reading. "The envoys delivered their message," he said, sinking into a chair beside her. "They speak of war if I do not honor the treaty." His voice was heavy with the weight of crown and kingdom. Marta's hands trembled as she set down her book. "Surely, they would not wage war over a marriage?" "They would use any excuse," Alaric replied. "The treaty was meant to end centuries of border conflicts. They see my feelings for you as an insult to their princess, their honor." He reached for her hand, his touch gentle despite his troubled words. The next morning, Alaric called an emergency council meeting. Nobles filled the great hall, their silk robes rustling as they took their seats. The foreign envoys stood like dark statues near the throne, their faces cold with disapproval. Alaric rose, his voice ringing clear across the hushed chamber. "I will not forsake the woman who saved my life, who has proven her worth 1,000 times over. Love and honor must guide a prince as surely as duty." Gasps and murmurs rippled through the assembly. An elderly duke stood, his voice quavering but firm. "Your Grace, we cannot risk war for the sake of sentiment. Think of the villages that would burn, the sons and fathers who would die. The enemy masses troops even now at the border. Another noble added. They only await word of your final defiance. The foreign ambassador stepped forward, his accent thick with barely contained anger. My master's patience grows thin. You have until the next full moon to fulfill your sworn obligation. That evening, as servants lit the palace lanterns, Marta sat alone in her chamber. Tears fell silently as she pulled a worn carpet bag from beneath her bed. She could not, would not, be the cause of bloodshed. Better to slip away now, return to her humble cottage by the river, than see war ravage the land she loved. Her hands shook as she folded her old dress, the one she had worn when she pulled Alaric from the flood. She left the fine gowns they had, made for her hanging in the wardrobe. They belonged to a dream that could never be. Into the bag went her prayer book, a loaf of bread, and the small silver cross her husband had given her before his last voyage. "Forgive me," she whispered, though Alaric could not hear. "I cannot bear to bring such suffering to your people." A cool breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the scent of rain. Somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called, its cry as lonely as her heart. She moved quietly, packing by candlelight, preparing for a departure that would save a kingdom but break her heart. The bag slowly filled with the few possessions that truly belonged to her, each item a reminder of the simple life she must return to, for the good of all. In the pale light of dawn, while most of the palace still slumbered, Marta slipped quietly through the servants' entrance. Her few belongings were packed in a simple cloth bag. The fine dresses given to her at court remained hanging in the wardrobe. Only a single silk ribbon, blue as the prince's eyes, found its way into her pocket. The carriage waited in the shadows, its driver discreet and silent as arranged. Marta settled into the worn leather seat, fighting back tears as the wheels began to turn. Through the window, she watched the grand palace grow smaller until it disappeared behind the morning mist. The journey home followed muddy roads that wound along the Danube. Spring rains had left deep ruts that made the carriage sway and creak. Each mile carried her further from Alaric, yet closer to the simple life she'd known before. By midday, the familiar sight of fishing boats dotting the river told her she was nearly home. Her cottage stood just as she'd left it, though the garden had grown wild in her absence. Inside, dust had settled on every surface, and the hearth was cold and dark. Marta set to work immediately, finding comfort in the familiar rituals, sweeping floors, lighting fires, airing linens that smelled of must and memories. In the days that followed, she forced herself back into her old routines. Each morning, she rose before sunrise to check her nets along the riverbank. Her hands, grown soft at court, soon roughened again from work. Yet every task carried echoes of what she'd lost. The nets reminded her of the storm-tossed night she'd pulled Alaric from the river. The hearth recalled quiet suppers shared in his private chamber. Even the sound of church bells brought back memories of walking with him through the spring fair. "Stop this foolishness," she would whisper to herself. "You are a fisherman's widow, nothing more." But her heart refused to forget. On the 4th, morning after her return, Marta was mending nets in her dooryard when she heard familiar voices calling from the river. Looking up, she saw an old fishing boat approaching her dock, its weather-worn sail catching the morning light. At the tiller stood the old fisherman, his white beard blowing in the breeze. "God be praised, you've come." Marta hurried down to help secure the boat. The old man's hands, gnarled as oak roots, clasped hers warmly. "Aye, lass. As soon as your letter reached me, I knew I must come." His eyes, sharp despite his years, studied her face. "You've been crying." Marta brushed at her cheeks. "There is much at stake. The Duchess claims my Henrik aided smugglers. If it's true, it's not." The old fisherman's voice rang with certainty. "I was there that night. though that fine lady at court wouldn't know it. Henrik died a hero's death. Inside her cottage, he told the full tale over cups of strong tea. Henrik had discovered smugglers using fishing boats to move contraband upriver. Rather than join their scheme, he'd alerted the river patrol. In the fight that followed, he'd helped the guards even as it cost him his life. I gave testimony to the magistrate, the old man said, pulling a sealed document from his coat. But someone at court made sure it was buried. Now I've brought a fresh copy, sworn before witnesses and bearing the magistrate's seal. Your Henrik died serving the law, not breaking it. Marta's hands trembled as she held the paper. Here was proof of her husband's honor and evidence of the Duchess's lies. Tears of relief spilled down her cheeks as she clasped the old fisherman's weathered hand. "God forgive me," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I must return to him, to Alaric. He needs to know the truth." The old fisherman squeezed her fingers. In his eyes, she saw understanding of both her grief for Henrik and her love for the prince. Some might judge her for opening her heart again, but this old soul who'd known her husband's true worth gave his blessing with a simple nod. The spring rains pelted the carriage windows as Marta journeyed back to the palace, each mile bringing both hope and trepidation to her heart. The old fisherman sat across from her, his weathered hands clutching a leather pouch containing the precious testimonies. For 2 days, they traveled through muddy roads and swollen streams, the wheels sometimes struggling in the wet earth. "Be strong, lass," the fisherman encouraged her as she pressed a hand to the window, watching the palace towers emerge through the misty morning air. "Truth has a way of coming to light, like the sun after a storm." Marta nodded, though her face was pale with exhaustion. Her simple dress, though clean, showed the wear of travel. Dark circles shadowed her eyes from 2 nights of fitful sleep at roadside inns, but determination burned bright in her gaze. The palace guards recognized her immediately, and whispers spread through the corridors like wildfire. "The widow has returned." Servants paused in their duties to offer quick, encouraging smiles. Even those who had taught her courtly ways just weeks before seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Word reached Prince Alaric quickly. He commanded the great hall be opened, and nobles were summoned from their morning activities. The Duchess arrived last, her face a mask of practiced serenity that barely concealed her unease. Before the assembled court, Marta stood straight-backed despite her weariness. The old fisherman stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed chamber. "I bring truth long buried," he announced, pulling out yellowed papers and a captain's log. These documents prove that Henrik Havel, Marta's husband, died, a hero's death fighting river smugglers 3 years past. A murmur rippled through the crowd as witnesses were called forth. Elderly rivermen who had seen Henrik's final battle, a merchant whose goods had been saved by his sacrifice, even a former smuggler who had reformed and now testified to Henrik's bravery. "He gave his life protecting honest trade on our waters," the fisherman declared. "The truth was known, yet somehow buried." His eyes fell meaningfully on the Duchess, who had grown very still. Prince Alaric rose from his seat, his face dark with controlled anger. "Duchess Isolde," he said, his voice cutting through the whispers. "You knew of this testimony, did you not? Yet you sought to use its absence to threaten an innocent woman." The Duchess's composure cracked. "Your Grace, I only wish to protect the dignity of silence." Alaric's command echoed off the stone walls. "You have shown neither dignity nor honor. Your plots end here. You are stripped of your position at court and will retire to your country estates immediately." The crowd of nobles shifted uncomfortably, but none dared speak in the Duchess's defense. From the galleries above, where common folk were permitted to observe, a cheer began to build. It grew into a roar of triumph as the Duchess, her face now ashen, was escorted from the hall. Alaric turned to face the assembly, his voice ringing with authority. Let it be known that peace built on falsehood cannot stand. The proposed treaty would bind our lands in a loveless union, while God himself has shown his will through the courage and virtue of this woman before you." He descended the dais steps, each footfall echoing in the now silent hall. Marta's heart thundered in her chest as he approached, his eyes never leaving hers. When he reached her, he took her work-roughened hand in his own. "Marta Havel," he proclaimed, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "You saved my life with no thought of reward. You have shown grace in hardship, strength in adversity, and truth in the face of lies. Before all assembled, I name you my chosen bride." The silence that followed was electric, charged with the weight of history being made. Marta's hand trembled in Alaric's grasp, but her voice was steady as she answered, "My prince, my life is yours, as my heart has been since that stormy night." They stood together, humble widow and noble prince, their joined hands a bridge between two worlds that had for too long been kept apart. In that moment, before the eyes of nobles and commoners alike, love triumphed over ancient prejudice, and truth shone brighter than any crown. The bells of St. Maria's Chapel rang joyously across the water, their peals echoing off the ancient stone walls and dancing across the river's surface. By special license from the bishop himself, hastened through papal dispensation in recognition of Marta's brave rescue, the banns had been read thrice in rapid succession over the past week. Now, on this bright morning, villagers lined the path to the riverside chapel where Marta had once worshipped as a simple widow. They scattered rose petals and wildflowers before her feet as she approached, wearing a gown of white silk that whispered against the stone path. Her dark hair was crowned not with jewels, but with delicate river lilies gathered at dawn by the village children. In the chapel, nobles stood shoulder to shoulder with fishermen and merchants. Even the foreign envoys, who had once threatened war, now watched with diplomatic smiles as love triumphed over politics. The morning sun streamed through stained glass windows, casting rainbow lights across Marta's face as she walked toward her prince. Alaric waited at the altar, his eyes bright with joy and unshed tears. He wore his formal military dress, but his expression was that of a man, not a prince, tender, vulnerable, and completely in love. They spoke their vows in clear, strong voices that carried to the furthest corners of the chapel. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Alaric drew Marta close and kissed her with gentle reverence. The assembled crowd erupted in cheers, and calls of "Long live our queen!" echoed off the chapel walls. One by one, the nobles approached, to bow before their new queen. There was no reluctance in their movements now, no hint of former disdain. They had witnessed her courage, her grace, and her truth, and they bent their knees in genuine reverence. As evening settled over the palace, Marta stood at the window of their new chambers, gazing out at the mighty river where their story had begun. The water gleamed silver in the fading light, peaceful now where it had once raged with storm. Alaric's arms encircled her from behind, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. "You pulled me from drowning," he whispered against her hair, "but it was your love that gave me life." Marta leaned back into his embrace as the fire crackled softly in their chamber hearth, its warm light a testament to hope, to love, and to divine providence that had brought a humble widow and her prince together against all odds. If something today spoke to the part of you that still believes in love, stay a while. Subscribe. I'll be here again tomorrow with another story worth feeling.